Welcome back to The Bible is Art, where we're in a series walking through, sentence by sentence, this book right here, the Poetics of Biblical Narrative, and let's get into it. So we're in the preface here, and here's how it goes. Some of the book's theses and analyses have appeared in a long series of articles on the subject, and I'm grateful for permission of the use of this material. So he just goes through a couple of articles that were precursors to this, and so we can just skip over those. The two earliest articles were written in collaboration with Menachem Perry. As the notes will indicate, I've also freely transplanted those ideas and examples from my various theoretical studies, or perhaps I should say retrieved, since the theories themselves often trace back to my exploration of biblical practice. This being a rather long book, it is only fair to point out that the argument covers both less and more ground than may appear. Less because it does not incorporate all the work I've done on the Bible since the 60s, not even all the published work. The emphasis here falls not just on the narrative as distinct from other genres, but on narrative principles crucial to the marriage of ideology to reading that governs biblical poetics. Okay, we have to stop here for a second because he's going to use this word. It's in the title, ideological literature and the drama of reading. And he's going to use the word ideology. What does he mean? Ideology, he just means the vision of the author, his worldview, his picture of the world. And so he says right here, the emphasis falls not just on the narrative as distinct from other genres, but on those narrative principles crucial to the marriage of ideology to reading that governs biblical poetics. So the marriage of ideology, the vision of the author, to reading that governs biblical poetics. So the poetics are just the literary principles, the mechanisms for communicating and instantiating that vision, the ideology of the author. It's come nowadays to mean something negative, but it does not mean anything negative here. Involving problems underrated or neglected in literary theory itself, the working and rules of this ideological art need systematic reconstruction. So this is what he's going to be doing. He's going to be reconstructing the mechanisms, the poetics, the different ways in which the author communicates his vision, his ideology. To keep the argument in focus, therefore, I reserve for separate treatment issues like the Bible's generic variety, its composition of units into books, or its modes of rendering speech and thought discussed in some of the papers listed above. So he's saying, I'm not covering everything, and I'm not going to cover what he says here, its generic variety, that is, its genres, the various types, ways the genres interact in the biblical text, its composition of units into books. So, all biblical books can be broken down in sort of like arcing structures, just like a film is broken down into episodes and scenes and acts up to the whole work. If you want the best thing that's written on that, the book by David Dorsey, The Literary Structure of the Old Testament, the first or second chapter where he goes over the main ways to identify, the main ways that the biblical authors use in segmenting their text. So how do you know when you've reached like the end of a section? That's the best book on that aspect. Or its modes of rendering speech. So how the biblical authors deal with speech is different and needs close attention. But he's like, I'm not going to talk about that here. On the other hand, this volume covers more ground than the table of contents may suggest. For one thing, since narrative always works in opposition to other genres and biblical narrative, even incorporates them into its prose, questions of generic variety often rise to the surface. So you have multiple different genres in the biblical text that work together. For instance, John Sailhammer has noted how in the Pentateuch, how poetry functions in the text, and so it functions in interesting ways. And so the use of genres in genres is interesting. Such glances at the meaningful opposition between prose, narrative, and poetry or parable bear, for instance, on speech situation, rhetorical strategy, transparency of discourse, making sense of discrepant or, on the contrary, parallel and apparently repetitive units. So he's saying if you look at the meaningful opposition or relationship relationship between prose and narrative poetry or parable bear. So like how these things interrelate. For instance, we'll learn stuff about speech situation, rhetorical strategy, transparency. We'll learn about all these things, parallel or repetitive units. Repetition is one thing that Meir Sternberg is particularly good at addressing, because often when you first read the Bible and you see things that are seemingly repetitive, your first idea is like, oh, it just must be for emphasis. And sometimes, but there are lots of other things that repetition, how it functions, and there are tools that you can use for how to understand repetition. Within narrative itself, for another thing, my tracing of the Bible's rich and novel repertoire of forms is intentionally distributed in order to put it in its proper place. However impressive that repertoire, it still figures only as a means to an end, offering the biblical artist an assorted set of choices to be made and coordinated and varied according to higher principles. Okay, so this is really important. So this book, this Poetics, is going to be an explanation of these literary forms, these literary mechanisms that the biblical authors use. But what he's saying there is that he's saying these are, and this is one of the particularly good things about Meir Sternberg. What he's going to say here is that it's not just like this cookie cutter type thing. Is that they have all of these poetic tools available to them, narrative tools, literary tools available for them, but they're always in service of higher order principles. So they will get stretched and squeezed and formed in order to communicate this message. So we have to be attentive readers to be able to identify how it's being used. So it's a sort of perfect blending of art and science. Contrary to what some attempts at literary analysis seem to assume, form has no meaning apart from communicative, historical, ideological, and aesthetic function. Once again, this has to do with you can't just take these literary forms like repetition, analogy, metaphor, specific types of characterization, and you just clonk them together. It's like these are means of communicating a larger message, right? Nor has its typology as such. Accordingly, I've decided against isolating several of the Bible's protean forms that I am most concerned with in a variety of roles and contexts. That is to say, he's saying, I'm not going to take some of these really primitive, fundamental literary features and sort of treat them in their own chapters. And this is because they're so like he said in the previous few sentences, they're so sort of flexible that it's helpful to see them in context of other things. And next here, we're going to get one of these beautiful, this is what will recur throughout this whole book, these sort of lists of poetics, essentially, of these literary tools. And what's fascinating, one thing that you could do is as you read through these lists, is that ask yourself to just be okay, do I understand what this thing is? Because this is one of the fundamental means of communication for the biblical authors. So I should know what this is. So I have these all underlined in my book. To mention three that recur throughout: analogical structure, modes of naming or reference, types of quotation, including dialogue and free indirect style. So these things are going to be protean, so they're so fundamental, right? And they're going to be woven through all the chapters. So when we talk about characterization, when we talk about plotting, we're going to talk about plotting and analogical structural will function in the chapter on plotting. It will function in the chapter on characterization, for instance, right? Analogical structure has to do with, it's essentially just when you have an analogy. So you have two things and they're similar. So this often happens in plotting in the Bible. So this happens in Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 when you have the first and the second sin. And there's all these parallels about how the sin happens, how God comes and confronts them, and how they respond, et cetera, et cetera. And you have all these similarities which is the mechanism so that the author can see that these two things are supposed to be parallel, they're supposed to be analogical, but we're supposed to learn something from this analogical structure. So we're saying, okay, so we're supposed to compare these. And there's many ways that we could, the ultimate meaning, the overarching meaning could be communicated, right? So In Genesis, and this is a much longer conversation, but the function of it is to say this theological sin against God, it produces, effects, is the cause of this social sin of brother killing brother, right? This relational sin. And so there's a causal connection here, but we need to compare these things. We say, hey, there's a relationship between these two things, right? And that type of analogical structure comes up all the time. This is true in Genesis 38 and 39, or maybe 40, where you have where you have Judah and Tamar, and you have Joseph and Potiphar's wife, right? Where you both have a sexual temptation, but you're contrasting these figures. That's analogical structure. Modes of naming and reference. Naming is extremely important in the Bible. Types of quotation. Sometimes dialogue will be directly quoted. Sometimes it will be free indirect style. Readers with special interest in such techniques may want to consult the index as well as references to more continuous discussions given the notes. And that's all we're going to read out of the preface. We're about a page and a half in, and I'll see you in the next video. Let me know if you've got any questions.